Would You Still Love Me If? Written by Yellowsunflowerheart and read by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary. After Aunt May's death, Tony is awarded custody of Peter. The boy is crippled with nightmares and they handle them together. Between quiet dads, I love yous, and wacky midnight conversations starting with, Would you still love me if? Or 5+1. 5 times Peter sleep talks, and 1 time Tony realizes he's actually awake. Tony loved those little moments, the conversations he had when Peter was sleep talking. He lived for the slip of Peter's tongue, every little dad he got from the boy. For decades it scared him. He wanted nothing to do with fatherhood. But Peter had changed all of that, had squashed every fear he had. Howard was a father, not a dad, and Tony was nothing like him. Peter assured him of that every day. Still, Peter wouldn't call him Dad in the light of day, but he did there. When Tony had woken him from a screaming nightmare in the middle of the night, when the Iron Man curled around him and held him so he wouldn't hurt himself as he shook. They'd stay like that until he calmed, until their breaths were in sync, and Peter's hand would rest on his arm, letting him know that he was back. Tony would loosen his hold only a little, enough for Peter to wriggle into a comfortable position. They didn't talk about the nightmares anymore. Tony could almost guess which one it was from the way that Peter cried. Tony recognized the work ones from his own night terrors. The way Peter screamed was all too familiar. The things Peter mumbled usually told Tony whether it was space-related, or the dusting, or just plain Thanos himself. The dreams about May were completely different. He cried when he dreamed about May. Those were the hardest for Tony, because there was no happy ending for Peter. At least with the memories of Titan or London, Peter could wake and see he was safe, know that it was all over. The pain of losing May was never ending. He'd cry when he was asleep. He'd cry when he woke up. There was no words Tony could say to make it better, and it killed him. It truly did. Listening to Pete sob damn near broke Tony every single time. It had been 2 months since Peter moved in, since the night that Tony got the call. He'd raced down to the hospital at 3 a.m, still dressed in his pajamas. He'd thrown an open sweater over the top in an attempt to look halfway decent, but his 2 different shoes had given him away. Peter was sat in one of the plain, bright waiting rooms, his eyes red and puffy, cheek stains with new and old tears. He looked so small sitting there, so young. And while Tony knew the moment he got out of bed, he knew now. Peter was his. Without a doubt, whatever it took, he was taking Peter home. He sat with the boy and let him cry for a while. Peter had soaked the shoulder of his shirt straight through. Tony had tried to keep himself together, to be strong for Peter, but there were stray tears that landed in Peter's hair as he held the boy. Tony remembered this feeling, wouldn't ever forget it. Losing his mum made him want to cry and scream and vomit, just bury himself 6 foot under. Peter had felt this too many times, had lost far too many people in his short life. Tony would give anything to take that pain away, but he couldn't. Peter had to grieve. It was the only option that was good for him, Tony knew, but it still hurt. He'd bundled Peter up when one of the nurses came to speak to them. They had already been working on Peter's temporary custody arrangements before he got there. Tony hadn't known May had listed him as a trusted contact, should Peter ever need it. He hadn't known she asked Peter to be placed in his care should she ever pass or be incapacitated, though he thanked her smart thinking. It made everything a lot easier. He could take Peter home faster. It wasn't the end of their fight. Peter wouldn't just be given to him, but it helped in the short term. It stopped Peter falling straight into the system. It meant Tony could take care of him the way he needed to be, and in the morning Tony would get his lawyers to start on the case and have permanent custody of Peter. Tony carried him to the car like a baby that night, Peter sniffling in his shoulder the entire time. He helped the teen to his seat, buckled his belt for him before he rounded the car and drove them back to the apartment. The sun had started to rise when they made it back, and Peter just stared out over the horizon as it slowly lit up. Tony put the coffee on and pondered whether or not to make breakfast. Peter really should eat, but Tony couldn't blame him if he didn't want to. It was like that for days. Peter was too quiet, and it made Tony anxious. Tony wasn't set up for guests. The guest bedroom hadn't been touched since Pepper dressed it a number of years ago, the first time she moved in. It was probably covered in layers of dust, with faded sheets and a stale smell. He'd have to fix that ASAP. But in the meantime, he arranged Peter in his room. The boy had nothing but the clothes on his back, so Tony had dug out his best t-shirt and some sweats. Both were too big for the teen, but they were fresh and clean, and Tony laid Peter on his bed before he grabbed a damp face towel and started to clean the stale tears from the boy's cheeks. Peter was far away. Tony could see it in his eyes. He didn't try to find him, didn't speak to Peter at all. Tony carefully cleaned his cheeks and had gone to give him some space when the kid reached out and desperately grabbed at his arm. "Please, don't leave." Tony's heart squeezed and he forced himself to remain composed as he turned around. Tony rounded the bed and sat in the space beside Peter, contemplating if he should touch the boy or not. He didn't want to smother him, but he wanted to be there for the kid. Peter made it easy for him, grabbing Tony's arm and using it to cuddle with. Tony started to comb through his hair with his other hand. They stayed like that in silence, Peter dealing with the numbness until he fell asleep around 7 a.m. That's how it went for a number of nights. Some days Peter didn't even get out of bed. Often Tony would wait to the sounds of Peter sobbing, and he quickly learnt what Peter wanted in those moments. The kid had always been tactile, and he made no efforts to push Tony away as he bundled the kid up in his arms. Tony had prepared the guest room, but Peter was still sharing his bed, unable to be by himself for long periods of time. Tony tried to coax him into the lab, just for a change of scenery and some different air. The billionaire fed him bite by bite for days, had even spoken to the sorcerer on Blaker Street to see what foods were best, considering Peter's lack of appetite. He had meetings with lawyers and government agents. Tony was doing his best to speed everything up regarding custody of Peter, so he didn't have to be dragged through anything more than was absolutely necessary. All of this on top of planning a funeral. They gave Peter some time, and they said their official goodbyes to May a week and a half after her passing. A couple weeks after the funeral, Peter decided he wanted to go back to the apartment to collect some things. Tony had an assistant change the name on the leasing agreement when everything had happened, had been paying the rent on the home, and would continue to do so until Peter was ready to sort May's things and empty the apartment. Peter only grabbed a few things that day, some more clothing, his pillow, May's pillow. It remained unspoken between them that nothing had been moved since the night that Peter and May left for dinner and never returned home. Peter packed his toiletries in a bag, and Tony fetched a few photos that were scattered around the room. It had been about a month, and the familiar smell of Peter had long worn off. Tony hadn't seen that sparkle in his eyes once, hadn't heard the ramble of a sudden idea in the lab. It hurt him just as much to be in that apartment as it did Peter, because it reminded him that this was just a shell of the boy he loved, and he hoped someday soon just to smell that familiar shampoo in his hair, and a t-shirt that didn't smell like something Tony hadn't worn in 10 years. He'd let the Iron Man take him to lunch that day, and Tony was astronomically relieved to see Peter finally eat a full meal, or what he could on such an empty stomach. The sun on his cheeks had left a shade of pink under his eyes, and Tony was grateful for the sign of health in the boy. From then on, things had changed, but others stayed the same. Peter often went to bed before Tony, and there were still some nights when Tony would stumble into his room and find Peter asleep on one side. They didn't talk about it. Tony didn't care one bit about the surprise bed companion. He'd simply do his best not to wake Pete when he joined him. Peter was still tormented with nightmares of all sorts, and Tony wouldn't interrupt a second of peaceful sleep. They'd deal with the terrors together. Tony was only ever a room away when Peter needed him, ready at the first sign of a nightmare to protect his kid from anything, including his own mind. And after Peter calmed down and dozed off, that was when Tony was rewarded, when he finally got to hear the boy call him Dad. 1. Tony had woken to Peter shouting only a couple of hours after they'd gone to bed. It took him a moment to get his bearings, to recognize his bedroom, the time, to make sense of the noise. It all hit him like a truck. The last few months flashed through his mind, and he quickly stumbled to his feet tossing his blanket aside before he raced down the hall to Peter's room. It was close by, just a few yards to the left, on the opposite side of the hall. Just a dozen long strides, but it always felt too far away on these nights. Tony didn't hesitate before he burst through the door, rushing to Peter's side to force the boy awake, freeing him from his nightmare. "Pete! Peter!" The boy shot awake when Tony shook his shoulder. Hey, kid," Tony sang sweetly, as though he was talking to a young child. "You're okay. You're okay. You're safe. You're safe in the tower with me, okay, kiddo? You're all right." Tony always made sure not to give him empty words, to tell him the truth and always mention where he was, who he was with, and most importantly, that he was safe. It was standard procedure of a panic attack, knowledge and grounding. Peter understood what he was seeing and why, knew he was safe despite his body arguing that he wasn't. He stared blankly for a few moments before it seemed Peter recognized him and their surroundings. When it looked safe to do so, Tony slipped into the bed and laid down, squished up close behind Peter and wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him secure to his chest. "Sorry." "Don't apologize." Tony shook his head. The boy never had to apologize for anything. "I woke you again." "Doesn't matter. Just focus on your breathing, okay?" "Is Dr. Strange okay?" "So, another Titan dream then?" "Yeah, he's okay. Probably driving Wong mad. We're all safe at home, remember? We're not there anymore. We all made it back in one piece." Tony let it sink in. It took another half-hour before he felt Peter go limp in his arms, and he figured Peter had finally become conscious enough to remember those events were so long ago. Peter thanked him once he'd calmed, and Tony simply combed his fingers through the boy's hair, encouraging him back to sleep. Some days it worked. Others they'd lay awake together for hours. Tony didn't really mind. As long as Peter wasn't spiraling, he was content. It seemed like a good night. Peter wasn't fighting the exhaustion he felt. He wasn't startling awake every time his eyes dropped closed. He welcomed the dark like an old friend, and Tony was glad he drifted off again. "Dad?" The simple word always made the fireworks in Tony's heart set alight. Would you still love me if I was a worm?" "Yes." "Okay." Tony laughed quietly. "Did you just ask me if I'd still love you if you were a worm?" "Yeah." Tony tried not to laugh harder. "You're cute." Tony pushed up on his elbow and pressed a kiss to Peter's cheek. The boy scrunched up his nose, but didn't say anything further as Tony laid him back down. Peter's breaths were calm and slow. Despite the sleep-talking, Tony would guess he was quite deeply asleep. It pulled a weight off his shoulders, and finally, Tony let his own guard down. Content that Peter felt safe, he himself fell asleep, sharing the team's pillow, neither of them waking until morning had broken. 2. Tony had been fiddling in the workshop before he was interrupted. It was a little after 3 a.m, and he'd yet to go to bed, tired, but unable to sleep. Nothing out of the ordinary. He'd been thinking over suit upgrades for Peter. If he ever wanted to pick it up again, that is. Tony would continue to work on it, though, until the day that Peter told him not to. He hoped the boy would regain his sense of self again, and would one day find that release once again in his secret identity. Tony wouldn't rush him, but he'd be ready for the day the boy came to him with the question, "Can I go on patrol tonight?" "Boss?" His AI cut through the music. "Friday?" "Little boss has become restless." Tony had hardly stood up before Friday updated him again. "Peter is screaming in his sleep, boss." "I know, Fry. I got him." Tony ran up the stairs, skipping the elevator and taking the steps 2 at a time. He sprinted down the hall and into Peter's room, loudly coming to a skidding halt at the boy's side. He was drenched in sweat, and scream didn't seem a bold enough word for the distress that Peter was in. It was more like a squeal, broken between cries. This one was a terror nightmare, Peter's worst fears come true. It wasn't PTSD like most. One night, it had been a vision of Ned, pinned to his chair by a spear, already deceased before Peter could help him. Another night, it had been MJ, just out of reach of his fingertips as she fell from an unsurvivable height. He dreamt of Happy and Pepper downed in an aeroplane, Harley pinned over the weight of a collapsed workbench, all alone in Tennessee with no one to hear him scream. He dreamed the worst outcome of Rhodey being shot out of the sky, and Tony attacked in the lab without armor, bleeding out on the floor. These were the losses he was preparing himself for, the people he still had left to lose. It killed Tony that Peter expected everyone in his life to leave, that he thought that he was somehow cursed to bring death to those he loved. These nightmares isolated him, left him all alone. They riddled him with guilt and terror and grief and dread, because this was what was coming. These were the deaths that he'd have to grieve next. For that fact alone, Tony had gotten far more careful after Peter lost his third parental figure. He wasn't going to let Peter lose him too. He had to stick around for Peter, be there for him, raise him. And Tony did everything in his power to keep everyone else safe too. Pete, Rue. Tony stroked his hair. Wake up for me, baby. When Peter came round, he almost choked on the gasp of air he took in. Tony took him gently by the cheeks, careful but sure, directing the kid's eyes to him and guiding him through the slow breaths until his heartbeat slowed down and Peter could breathe adequately on his own. Tony didn't ask him what he'd lost in his dream. He wanted to take the boy far, far away from it, hopefully not even a memory left of it by morning. He left Peter to collapse in his pillow as he went for a washcloth, patting the sweat away from the teen's temples and cooling it over his collarbones. The sheets were a little damp, but Peter didn't ask to change them, and honestly, Tony had slept on far worse, so he tossed the rag to the side and slipped under the covers beside Peter, turning the ceiling fan on for a few minutes to combat the heat. Despite Peter sweating, the kid didn't hesitate to snuggle in Tony's side, face buried in Tony's neck. He went as far to throw a leg across Tony's hips, desperate to be as close as possible. Tony drew comforting circles into the bare skin by Peter's knee with his thumb, the arm wrapped around Peter, squeezing the boy just a little closer. In those moments, Tony wished there was something more he could do. Holding him seemed useless. He needed to take the pain somehow. You haven't been to bed yet? Peter noticed. I haven't felt tired. I've been working in the lab. On what? Tony shrugged. Just bits and pieces. Tell me about it while I fall asleep? Sure, kid. So Tony rambled, just the thing he was good at. He kept the details of the iron spider to himself, not wanting to pressure or overwhelm Peter. Instead, he talked about stupid things the bots did, made up conversations between them. He talked about his idea for renovations in the lab and Peter's room to adapt both to the extra company. Peter's finger had been drawing circles against the chest of Tony's shirt before it fell still, and Tony was relieved that he'd fallen back asleep, though he kept talking for a while, just to be sure Peter was deep down before he let any guards fall. The muscle of Peter's thigh was smaller beneath Tony's hand than it should have been, given how fit he'd previously been, and Tony made plans to enhance the protection of the iron spider to accommodate that. He needed to get Peter out and about more, not in a gym. He knew Peter wasn't there, but they should take more walks together, get some sun on the boy's pale skin. Dad? Peter broke through his thoughts. Would you still love me if I dyed my hair blue? As long as it's not pink like Harley's, I'll forgive you. I don't want to dye my hair blue. And why'd you ask? Tony laughed. Just 'cause. I want you to feel entirely comfortable in your own skin, Peter. Whatever that looks like. You want new clothes? I'll take you shopping. You want to dye your hair? I'll help you whatever color you choose. You want to experiment with makeup or, I don't know, whatever else you want. I want you to do it, Pete. You don't need to worry about me. I love you no matter what. Okay? Okay. Peter's slurred words reminded Tony that he was in fact asleep and wouldn't remember anything he'd said in the morning. Still, Tony didn't mind saying it, because it was all true. He hoped Peter knew. This was the time for Peter to figure out who he wanted to be, and Tony would love him through every quirky and later regrettable phase. 3. It had been a bad day overall. Peter was struggling with his heightened senses. Tony had seen him fighting against them all day, trying to ground himself. He was still a little unsure of how to help. Some days, Peter wanted a lot of human connection. Other days, he just wanted his space. It was a clingy day. Tony felt incredibly guilty for loving those. He wasn't a perfect person. Peter had been on him from the moment he woke up, cornering Tony in the kitchen by the coffee machine, his face buried in the back of Tony's shoulder as he cuddled close. Tony could feel the tension in the boy, the focus on maintaining that composure. Tony had a protocol for these days. Friday would lower the shade over the windows and dim the lights. The AI herself was only allowed to speak so loud, and the apartment had to remain at an ideal temperature for Peter's enhancements. All day, Tony had catered to every one of Peter's needs. His requirement for touch. It was often the way the boy grounded himself. Focusing on one single sense helped him dramatically. He'd feel Tony's warm fingers between his, or the hairs on Tony's arm beneath his fingertips, and Peter would single in on it, until his brain was quiet and locked on one thing. Tony was pliant, letting himself be moved however Peter needed. The day was spent in silence, a feature that often threatened to put Tony on edge, but he'd fight it down every second, putting Peter first, and learning what it meant to sacrifice for your child, to provide for them, even while going out of your own mind. When Tony had gone to bed that night, Peter was already asleep and in the half furthest from the door. Tony took a quick shower in the ensuite and slipped under the sheets as carefully as possible, pressing a kiss to Peter's forehead before he rolled over the other way and fell asleep. When the Iron Man woke up, Peter had already woken himself. He wasn't in bed anymore. Rather, he was sat on the floor, back rested against the mattress as he sobbed into his hands. Tony scrambled to his hands and knees, crawling over the sheets and down to the carpet to sit beside the boy. He didn't hesitate to pull Peter to his side, holding him tightly as he cried and gasped for each breath. This one was a May dream. The pain in Peter's voice cut right through to Tony's heart. It was always unmistakable. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you, I'm with you." It was all Tony could say. He held Peter as tight as he could, rubbing comforting circles into the back of Peter's neck. Tony could feel the boy's tears down his shoulder, and he tried desperately to calm him down with soft whispers, reminders of his love and devotion to the kid, reassuring him that he'd never let go. Tony would always be right there, whenever Peter needed him. Minutes passed, Peter's cries easing until they were just wet, shaky breaths. When he was calm enough, Peter pulled away and climbed back into the bed. Tony let him go in his own time before he followed him, grabbing a tissue and cleaning up the snot and tears from Peter's face, then his own shoulder as he lay back down. The boy was still sniffling as Tony crawled under the covers, and they barely hit the pillow before Peter curled up to Tony's side, using his scarred chest for a pillow. Peter's face was hot from the tears, and Tony pressed cold fingers to his exposed cheek, hoping to soothe the burn under his skin. Tony felt the teen's eyelashes flutter against his hand. The kid closed his eyes, and slowly Peter's breath evened out, his body stilled as he fell back asleep. Tony waited up, in case Peter was still haunted by his previous nightmare. He wouldn't let himself fall asleep before half an hour, just in case. Right before he started drifting off, Peter mumbled, "Dad?" "Yeah, Rue?" "Would you still love me if I was an alien?" "Yes, baby, I would." Tony had to smile. "You'd be the sweetest alien in the universe." "You really think so?" "I know so." "How?" "Because." Tony took a deep breath. "You always put others first, and you never give up. You look out for the little guys. You'd still take care of our world and every other world." "Would you like me more than Thor?" "I always like you more than Thor. You're my kid, yeah? I love you more than anyone." It was still unfamiliar to say out loud. Tony had plans to change that. He should tell Peter more often that he loved him, should make it clearer that Peter was his kid, always had been. and he didn't have to save Dad for their sleep talk conversations. Tony was just adjusting to this new life he hadn't even known he'd craved. "You love me even if I had scaly green alien skin?" Peter pushed again. "Even then." Peter rolled over, making for an interesting position on the bed. He took up most of the space, his body now angled away from Tony, though his head still rested on Tony's chest. Tony kept a hand in the boy's hair, the other hand moving to caress the now exposed arms. Peter's eyelids fluttered, but otherwise he didn't stir. Tony just held him and stared for a while, until his own eyes got heavy, and he dozed off to the weight of Peter and his bony shoulder dug under his arm at his side. 4. It was a work nightmare. Tony knew because Peter was stuck. It was hard to wake him. Tony had pulled the boy into his chest, brushing hair away from Peter's forehead as he talked to him, trying to bring Peter back to reality. I don't want to go. Tony knew this was the dusting. Those few moments would play over and over on a loop until he woke up. An endless cycle. The terror clutched Peter's heart once again, fear of the unknown, fear of what would happen to what he left behind. It was one of the hardest nightmares for Tony, because he shared that terror. He too was taken back to that day, when Peter vanished to ash under his hands. He'd shaken for days aboard the ship, floating aimlessly in space, squeezing his eyes shut and opening, willing it to just be a premonition of the worst-case scenario. There weren't words for how much Tony missed Peter those 5 years he was gone. He hadn't truly let himself admit how much the kid meant to him before that. Some days, Tony would wake in tears. He'd spend the whole working day staring at the framed photo of the pair of them on his desk. Particularly in the early days, Tony would break his way into the Parkers' then abandoned apartment. He'd tinker around Peter's room, flipping at the pages of his homework on the desk, stare out the window where Peter would escape every night. He'd rummage through Peter's drawers for old shirts, breathing in the last remaining scent of the kid. Tony would curl up on his bed with the clothing and cry until the fabric was covered only in his aftershave and tears, no longer a reminder of Peter beyond the sighs and cheesy quotes. As the years went by, it had nothing to offer Tony but the knowledge that it was Peter's. Up until that very last weekend before they formulated a plan, Tony could be caught trespassing on the property, in which he'd taken over the lease. He'd curl up in the sheets on Peter's bed and stare at the stationery, the framed photos, scattered shoes across the floor. Tony felt like a parent grieving the loss of his child, and he wasn't sure how much more he could have borne if they hadn't found a way to bring them all back again. Peter was always the reason Tony even tried. He'd have worked himself until he dropped dead on the floor. He wouldn't give up on Pete. Couldn't. It was a loss he couldn't accept. He'd lose any other battle, as long as it was in exchange with having his kid back. He'd held Pete so tightly on that battlefield, and when all was said and done, Tony hugged him again, and this time he didn't let go. Suits disappeared. Tony took in the familiar scent of the kid he'd been missing for 5 years, even through the smoke and dirt and blood. This was his Peter between his hands, and Tony wasn't sure he could ever let go. These days, Peter lingered on his sheets, on the sofa, in the lounge. The ensuite smelled like him some days, if he hadn't bothered to go back to his own room to bathe. His shampoo and body wash sat on the shelf in Tony's shower, like it always belonged there. Now Tony held him tightly for other reasons, begging the kid to wake up once more. For present times, he was lucky enough to see brown eyes staring back at his. He could hold him, promise him that he was okay. I don't feel so good. Peter. Tony finally broke through the nightmare. Mr. Stark? Peter jumped. The name had become like a dagger to the chest ever since Peter started to call him Dad in his sleep. Still, he wouldn't correct whatever felt right for the kid, especially in a time of distress. He'd bear the weight of the world if it meant Peter got what he wanted. Whatever made it better for the kid.
"It's all over," Tony assured him, stroking the hair out of his face. "You're back. I brought you back."
"You brought me back?" Peter repeated.
"I'd have searched my whole life for you, if that's what it took." Tony caressed his cheeks. "Parents aren't supposed to outlive their kids. You're gonna die old when you decide you're ready to drift off peacefully in your sleep. In the meantime, you're my happy little sunflower, right? You're safe here with me. I'll always find you, any time you get lost."
Be it nightmares or anxiety, or in a literal sense, Tony would always find Peter, no matter how big or scary the world got. The kid had a devoted ally in Tony. He'd be a human shield until his dying breath. Nothing mattered unless it was for Pete. If Peter was lost, Tony had no purpose. There was no doubt that Tony was a dad above absolutely everything else. Tony wriggled closer, closed his eyes, and pressed his forehead to Peter's. He put everything he had in projecting safety towards the teen. He let Peter take whatever he wanted, knowing the teen was always grounded in the heat under Tony's skin and the touch of his fingers on the Iron Man's body. Peter calmed much faster than he anticipated, a ball of fabric from Tony's t-shirt fisted in one of his palms. Every slow breath of Peter's tickled over his skin, warm and steady, very much present and safe, just as Tony needed it to be. Peter sound asleep with not another care in the world. "Dad, can I ask a scary question?"
"Scary question?"
"Would you still love me if I had magic?"
Tony took a deep breath in and slowly let it go. "Yes."
"But you hate magic."
"But I love you."
"But it doesn't change."
"It changes everything," Tony insisted. "I trust you completely, Pete, and if you had magic, I would think it was in the safest hands possible."
"You really believe in me?"
"Always."
"I never hurt you," Peter promised.
"You never could."
Tony bumped Peter's nose with his own.
"I love you."
"I love you too." The whispered words drifted off in a breath, and Pete had nothing more to say that night. 5. Peter rarely ever napped, but Tony noticed he'd doze off sometimes around halfway through the movie. It was around 10 p.m. on a Saturday evening. Once, Tony and Peter would have been in the lab, deep in formulas and equations. Tony didn't mind this. Less some mildly depressed Peter, and it would actually be pretty damn perfect. Peter was doing better, even having paid attention to the movie to start with, asking Tony questions even though the boy knew the man had never seen it. It was a good sign that Peter was breaking through, that the numbness was dissipating and the pain was becoming a companion rather than crushing him. Tony had only known the boy had dozed off because of the gentle snores. He'd smiled at the kid, reaching for the throw rug folded atop the couch and carefully covering Peter with it. He looked cute and innocent, and Tony snapped a quick photo on his phone, deciding he'd carry Peter to bed once the credits of the movie had rolled. It was close. Tony's own eyes were dropping. He was forcing them open every few moments until he noticed Peter had started to stir. He tossed onto his back. He turned left and right a few times over, instantly alerting Tony, snapping wide awake once more as he moved to sit up and crawl closer to Peter. The boy suddenly woke himself with a jolt, almost headbutting Tony as he sat up in a fluster. There was sweat on his temples, and his eyes mirrored those of a cornered, terrified animal. He'd searched the couch and blanket before his eyes landed on the Iron Man, some understanding flooding in as he gained his reality. Before Tony could move any closer, Peter scrambled to his knees and crawled over the small space between them, settling as close to Tony as absolutely possible, squeezing in the tiny gap between his lap. Tony moved as quick as he could to accommodate him, wrapping Peter in his arms as the kid pressed his cheek into his chest. It took some time before he settled. Tony guessed he was looking for the Iron Man's heartbeat, if the constant head turns and annoyed huffs were anything to go by. With his ear pressed right on Tony's heart,
Peter sat sideways between his legs, head lolled to the side as he dozed off again. Tony had thrown his foot up on the couch, the one behind Peter, giving the boy his leg to lean on as he slowly fell pliant in the billionaire's hold. "Do you want to talk about it?" "I thought I was losing you," Peter whispered. "You could never lose me." Tony rocked him slightly. "You're stuck with me, whether you like it or not." "Good." Tony focused on nothing but Peter, rocking the boy in his arms, losing track of time. The credits to the movie rolled on screen, and Tony let them go. The gentle elevator music, the only thing to keep them out of silence, until Peter's sleep-talking struck again. "Dad, would you still love me if I ever burnt the lab down?" "Of course I would. None of that junk means anything near as much as what you mean to me." "Okay." "Everything in that workshop is replaceable. You're not." "What about Harley?" "Harley's different. I have more than enough room in my heart for the two of you. Neither of you could ever replace the other." "You don't sometimes wish he was here?" "I always wish he was here. Just not at the expense of losing you." Tony made that very clear. "I wish we were all here. I wish we could hang out in the lab until 4 a.m, and grab coffee and go watch the sunrise. You two could drive me crazy, and I could spoil you both with tech and takeout, and we could snuggle on the couch and make fun of movies, and you could both have whatever you wanted." The thought was dangerous, because Tony had never been more sure of anything in his life, that he really would cave to every one of Harley and Peter's requests. He'd spoil them like crazy, more than they'd even be able to ask. Just having Peter around, Tony had been bad enough. He had no impulse control. Hell, he ordered a $300 cupcake the other day to surprise Peter because it was cute. Tony was fairly certain the batter came from a cardboard box at the supermarket. He had tunnel vision when it came to his boys, wanting only the best for him. They were his heirs after all, and there were no safer place for them than under Tony's protection. He'd do anything to keep them close and out of the circles Tony used to run in. The ones that introduced him to alcohol and drugs and the playboy life, which left him entirely empty and completely depressed. "It would be nice if he was here," Peter agreed. "Yeah, but it's nice just us, too, right?" Peter nodded. "You don't want for anything more?" Tony checked. "No, I have everything I need. I mean, what I can have anyway." "I know, kid. I'm sorry." "It's okay. I still have you." "And I'm not going anywhere." Tony ran a hand through Peter's hair, and the kid leant into the touch. The Iron Man pressed a kiss into the boy's curls as their last few mumbles ended their conversation for the evening. "You and me against the world." "You and me protecting the world," Tony corrected. "Yeah, we did." Peter drifted off, and Tony followed not long after, majorly regretting it the next day when his back felt 100 years old. +1. Peter was shouting his name when Tony woke. It wasn't often that he could break a nightmare himself, and even less common for the boy to simply sit in bed and call out to him. It instantly put Tony on high alert, the hair at the back of his neck standing as he realized just how out of character it was that Peter was calling him Tony. Sure, Peter called him many names, but never his given name. He pushed the covers aside and ran out of the room and a few paces down to Peter's room, one of his suits at the ready in case he needed it. He wasn't sure what to expect on the other side of the door. It was unlocked, which was a good sign, but Tony wasn't letting his guard down until he laid his eyes on a safe Peter. "Tony! Tony!" "Here, I'm here." Tony narrowly avoided falling on his backside as he skid to a stop at the doorway, the door almost thrown off its hinges. "You okay?" Peter shook his head. "Okay. Are you safe?" Tony made his way closer. Peter nodded. "Another bad dream?" Tony popped down on the edge of the bed. Peter nodded. "Will you stay with me?" "Of course I will." Tony forced the suit that had followed him to make its way back down to the lab, and he ran a hand through his messy hair before he laid down beside Peter. The boy had rolled over, laid with his back turned to Tony, and the Iron Man easily slot in behind him, curling around the younger one and pulling him close. Peter dropped his weight back into Tony's chest, and they adjusted around each other until they were comfortable. It took Peter a while to settle. It must have been a new dream, this one, something still playing on his mind. Tony could feel the tension and the lingering flight or fight response. "Better?" Tony tried to comfort him. Peter nodded. "Get some sleep, baby." Tony held him tighter than he usually did. Peter needed it. Time passed and nothing eased. Tony figured it would be one of those nights where he'd lay awake until the sun rose. Then they'd go about their day with neither of them mentioning the fact. Something was playing on Peter's mind. It was obvious. And Tony seriously doubted that sleep was a possibility. He was confused from the moment Peter began to talk. "Dad." "If I ever fail a mission, and I don't save the day, would you still love me?" It was a terrifying thought, and deep down, Tony already knew the answer, but he had to ask. "Peter, are you awake?" "Yes." "Are you always awake when you ask me these questions?" "Yeah." "Peter, there isn't a single thing in the world that could stop me from loving you." Tony rolled him over and looked him in the eye. "Nothing. Peter, you can question everything else in the world, but never that. I'm here for the long haul. I love you, and you're not going anywhere. You're here with me, no matter what, okay? But what if I really, really screw up? Then we'll deal with it together. No matter how angry I get or what I have to do or lose to keep you safe. I will always love you. And I will always do everything in my power and more to keep you happy and safe. Understand?" Peter nodded. Tony pressed a long kiss to Peter's cheek before the boy rolled back over. The Iron Man adjusted his arms and pulled the boy closer, his head reeling over their previous conversations. To know Peter's questions were serious hurt. How could he ever let the kid doubt how much he cared for the boy? Peter was the only thing that mattered. Tony would go to the ends of the earth to protect him. He wouldn't ever let Peter screw up like that, have that on his conscience. Tony would be at his side through every fight, and if they lose, they'd do it together. His thumb caressed up and down over Peter's arm, and Tony took a few deep breaths, taking in the familiar scent of the kid to calm himself down. He wanted to squeeze Peter tight until he couldn't leave, wanted the kid to understand that Tony was right there with him, always would be, success or failure. Tony still loved him, always would. They'd get through anything together. "Is there something I've done wrong to make you doubt me, Pete?" Tony wondered, because the lack of answers were chewing away at him. "When we had that fight?" Peter didn't have to finish. Tony knew exactly what fight he was talking about. Peter was wearing the exact "I survived my trip to NYC" shirt that Tony had sent him home in. It wasn't so big anymore, and it reminded Tony how lucky he was to have seen Peter grow up, even if just for a couple years. Tony sighed. "I hate every second of that memory, Pete. I wasn't the man you needed to be back then. I failed you, and I promise it won't ever happen again." "I went home to Aunt May and cried." Tony buried his face in the pillow to discourage his own tears. "I should have been better. I should have taught you. It was my fault. Anyone could say anything they wanted about me. But you being disappointed in me was exponentially worse than any of that." "I love you," Tony professed. "I love you so much, and I won't ever hurt you again. I swear it. There is nothing you could do to ever make me walk away now. You are the center of my world. And whatever you do, there is nothing that could make me stop loving you. But will you stay? Because it's different. Yes, I will always stay. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. Please stop thinking about it. Tony pleaded, running a hand through his hair. You're mine, and I've got you, okay? You swear? I swear. Peter's shoulders caved as he shrunk in on himself, growing smaller in Tony's hold. The billionaire nosed at the back of the kid's neck, squeezing him a moment, unwilling to let go until he was sure Peter understood just how loved he was. Tony closed his eyes and wished all the love and protection he had to give towards the kid. He wished it was something he could show in a physical form, could hand over to Peter's delicate hands and show him just how much he mattered, how he'd given Tony's whole life a new purpose. He'd dedicate every day to loving Peter, however the kid wanted, cuddling him after school, telling the boy he loves him any chance he got. Tony had a lot more to learn, but he'd do it for Peter's sake. Can I call you Dad? Peter asked, suddenly, quietly. Tony was on the verge of tears instantly, furiously nodding his head. He choked out wetly, Yeah. Okay. Peter clutched at the sleeve of Tony's shirt, balling it between his fingers as though Tony might fade away otherwise. There were many things unspoken between them, at least from Tony's side, and there was no perfect time to unleash them, so Tony thought, why wait any longer? Peter deserved the truth. Peter? Would you still love me if I told you I don't feel guilty for loving this? You being here? Peter pulled tighter on Tony's sleeve. I'd give anything to change the circumstances, but I know. I like being here too. Good. Tony felt the weight of the world fall off his shoulders. It felt like some terrible secret, and it was in a way. It was disgusting that Tony found joy in the fact that Peter had been forced into his care, that getting Peter like this had come at the cost of May's life. Tony was never a perfect person, but this was a pretty high contender for his lowest of lows. He just couldn't help that there was no such thing as a con when it came to having Peter in his life full time. I just wanted you to know, in case you think I'm a bad person. I don't think you're a bad person, Peter denied. I wish it was different, but I'd never choose to leave here. I like being with you. I like being with you too. I know. Sometimes I just need a lot of reminders. Then I'll remind you every day how much I love you. Dad? Yeah, Pete? Can we maybe suit up and take a swing tomorrow? Yeah, I think we can do that. Tony grinned. I made you another suit. Do you want to try it out? Yes, please. Tony pressed another kiss to Peter's cheek, softly chanting the only words that had never been a lie. I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. Would you still love me if I had 6 toes? The boy grinned. Peter, please. Hey there guys, girls and non-binary pals, it's Eleanor and I hope you're having a lovely day today. Ooh, the tears. Wow, okay, sorry. I'm still not over it. I'm like still crying from finishing recording this. Like, jeez. This is so precious. Like, genuinely, this fic has such like a special place in my heart. Like, it's just wow. I love father-son bonding. You know, I love some heart comfort. You know, I love some trauma bonding. I can't get over just like Tony just having this continual, am I a bad person for like being happy he's in my life when that means May's dead? And you're like, oh, it's such a hard situation to be in, but like I understand because you just love him because that's your son, that's your boy. And like Peter just like progressively like getting like more and more realistic situations, and like this is how I feel. Dad. Anytime Peter calls Tony dad, like instantly like I'm crying, like it's just the good feelings. But please let me know what you guys thought about this fic, and how are you doing? How are you guys? Did you survive the AO3 takedown? I was not surviving. This was supposed to go up like 2 days ago, but I didn't get to finish it because AO3 went down, and like on like my 2 days off of work is when it was down, and I was like, thanks babe, I was supposed to record today, but we're here, we made it back. I said, you know what, who cares if I've been at work all day, I'm just gonna do this because it's got to be done. This one, it's just too precious, it's just so precious. Please talk to me about it. What did you do during AO3 takedown? Did you find any new podfickers? You know, on the Discord, I was like, everybody, spend this time on enjoying some podfics that are up that you can listen to. Did you find anybody new? Send me your recommendations. Did you find any like new fics that you wanted to do? Did you touch some grass? Did you leave your house? I did not. That was never gonna happen. It was not on the cards. But I hope all you guys are doing well. If you liked this video, and if you also cried, be sure to leave a like on the video if you liked it, and to boost my serotonin levels. You can also subscribe to be notified whenever I make new videos. I was looking at the numbers today, and like what, 200 away from like 4,000? That's crazy. That's crazy. Also, I think we have now hit, like, actually it was probably a while ago now, to be honest, but it has been over a year since I started podficking, which is crazy. Happy birthday to this channel, I guess, for, like, a month ago. It was a while ago. I just didn't really think about it, and it just kind of snuck up on me, and I was like, oh, geez, it's been a year. So, however long you've been around, whether that's been, like, a year or, like, a week, it's great to have you. I hope you're doing well. If you want to chat to me more, you can always join the Discord server. It's a great time over there. Yes, I have a Discord. Because I'm cool like that. I'm ridiculously uncool, but it is still a fun time, so you should do it. I also have a Ko-Fi if you want to check that out. And you can also follow me on like Twitter and Instagram. But until I see all you lovely, lovely people again, be sure to practice some self-care. Bed on time, 5 a day, brush your teeth, and drink some water. Seriously, this is a threat. And I'll catch you guys laters.